and younger adults who have died from COVID-19. The next one is a slide that shows what has happened where I work in North Carolina. If you see the gray line here, at one point in Durham, we saw that in the month of May, there were 70% of the cases that were positive for COVID-19. And at one point, even 75% in June. We've been working really, really hard to really get a message across on the importance of social isolation, using of a mask, and washing hands, but especially isolation, being more than 2 meters or 6 feet apart, and have been able to cut down on the numbers. COVID deaths in Durham County, not so far from you, has also been overrepresented. And then people in the emergency room have been overrepresented as well. The types of jobs of the Hispanics who are affected by COVID-19 have been construction workers and all affiliated occupations: painting, glass industry, plumbing, electrical contractors, heating and air conditioning, landscaping services, housekeeping, janitorial services, restaurant workers, childcare workers, and women or homemakers or unemployed. Now, it's always interesting trying to understand what are the factors. I really like looking at this World Health Organization graph that shows us who are the people who are most affected by these factors. And this probably should have been the approach that all governments in the world should have taken, looking at factors leading to increased vulnerability. This means that communities who have lack of clean water or sanitation, communities that have poor access to healthcare and basic services, communities with food insecurity and malnutrition, marginalized and underserved communities, communities that work or live in overcrowded or insufficient infrastructure, those who are dependent on informal economy and wages, those for whom systems of health and social and governance are weak, or those who are in armed conflict and violence, will be more seriously affected by something like a pandemic. And when we think about the Latinx community, unfortunately, we can check marks on poor access to healthcare and healthcare services, food insecurity and malnutrition, marginalization, overcrowding, high dependence on informal economy and daily wages, and even on the issue of weak systems of health and social governance. So we really have to think about how seriously this has been affected and understand why, when our community lives in these situations, and we talk about weak systems, for the Latinx community, is that country that decided that will turn away from immigrants, that started talking about their countries or their countries of origin as countries that were undesirable, the idea that immigration rates should be sending people away. So our government became something of a weaker area for our Latinx community. Testing sites, and this is just a graph of the testing sites in Durham. When the pandemic first started, and in this graph you can see blue dots are white people living in the community, green is Black people, and then Hispanics are in the yellow areas. When the pandemic started, they organized most of the testing sites in more affluent white parts of the community. And we started looking, so we started seeing all that increase that we saw early on, going up in numbers, and realizing that only in July we invested, or the city invested in testing sites where the actual most historically marginalized communities live. So that really caused the trouble of having to not travel to testing sites, the difficulty in accessing sites. So we have been really working on getting sites where the people live. So this has caused some distress. I am connected with some of the community organizers and people who are working who let me know when something is going on in the community. A typical text to me has been, Doctora, tengo otro desaparecido, which means, doctor, I have another disappeared person. And what that means is that the family is unable to find their patient. The family sent the patient by ambulance, somebody who was short of breath, and now they're calling the hospital and they are not finding him or her. And often that is connected with the difficulty with registration. The names are long names, the system not realizing that maybe, like in my case, I hyphenated my name, Martinez Bianchi, but I used the hyphen so that my name wouldn't be separated, so that often in the Latino community, we may have two last names, and our most important one is the first one, and then Anglo community may use the last one. Often family members are unable to go and see their patients, are having difficulty not knowing how they're doing. And sometimes not hearing from a team that is trying to call, they don't have the interpreter at the time when family are waiting to hear, and then they're not hearing. And so the fear that maybe a patient has died and they have not heard, and that the hospital is afraid of letting them know. One of the main issues for those who are working in healthcare is to resist the dehumanization of the intensive care unit, to resist thinking of this as COVID cases, but actually think of this as human beings who are suffering from a really severe, a potentially severe disease like COVID-19. Another thing that we're seeing is that people are reporting that they face unique challenges, and some of these unique challenges have to do with being taken seriously. When I say this, and this was a publication after community organizers started looking at people maybe being discharged too early from the emergency room or not being taken seriously, and that means normally when we go to the hospital, we tend to bring our family with us. But during the times of COVID, only the person that's sick is admitted into the emergency room and the family has to stay away. And when there's a limited language proficiency, even with the use of the interpreter, now what's happening is the interpreter lines are phones. And what we're seeing is a difficulty of some lack of cultural connection and cultural interpretation, or the family who will say, wait, no, Dad has been really short of breath, feeling very sick. This has been a longer term problem. So those are some of the issues that we're seeing also. And then today in the News and Observer, we saw without Spanish emergency alerts, rural North Carolina growing Latino population faces risk. There is no alert in Spanish. Many of our community are more recent immigrants who may not speak English, and there is a need to really communicate in the language. There's also high levels of acculturation stress that are now interacting with the pandemic stress. There's occupational stress, the fear of losing the job. Many people are working, and if they get tested and they're positive and then they need to isolate for the 14 days, sometimes is that the fear of if I'm not working, how am I going to feed my children? So it's that combination of having to actually decide, do I feed them or do I go to work? And then is the risk of exposing others. Discrimination in some cases has become worse. Immigration is the biggest fear. There is a fear that by utilizing the services in the hospital, they are going to be considered a public charge and then being asked or be deported for that reason. And then the issue of pre-migration, being prepared to put paperwork, etc., is also a significant risk, or for those who are deciding to move somewhere else or going back to their countries. Among the Latino community, being familiar, el familismo, familism, is normally a really important factor for resilience that allows people to be connected, to actually do better. But during times of COVID, working and living in a family, in a multi-generational family has become an issue of concern, where the majority of the message was to stay at home with your family. And in the Latino community, the family may be very large, so the risk of exposing others to the virus has become much more of a problem. There are other issues. The worry that your food will run out before you get money to buy more, right? If you're not able to work because you have to isolate. Are you worried about losing your housing? We are seeing 24% of the Latino community being afraid of losing housing and being evicted from their home. Now, interestingly, zero of the people of this survey done by the Hispano project at Duke identify anybody thinking that their needs were urgent. And this is part of that resilience of the community that normally wouldn't feel that they have to worry. You know, they already are immigrants. We're already strong. We can handle this type of attitude. So how do we approach this hardworking population of mostly essential workers who live in the interstitium of our society, in that space in the society that's not viewed and is not often taken into account? At Duke, we created, or I'm a co-founder of the Latin-19, the Latinx advocacy team and interdisciplinary network for COVID-19, with representation from community activists, Duke Health, family medicine, pediatrics, nursing, midwives, physician assistants, Duke University, different centers. And then we started small. We were about 20 or 30, and then it became expansive with representation from all these different NGOs, different disciplines, lawyers, human rights lawyers and immigration lawyers, students, chaplains, faith-based organizations, members of the Latino community, and also allies of the Latinx community. So it became this informal place where we meet every Wednesday at noon to talk about issues affecting the Latino community. And then we organize ourselves surrounding needs. Sometimes it has been the needs for PSA announcements, creation of posters or videos, communication to the media. It became advocacy, letter writing, access to care, and testing. What has been clear through the work that we've done with Latin-19 is that if we are united, we are much stronger. Unidos, somos más fuertes. And that many of us are on the front line. There is this idea that healthcare providers only work on the front line, and it's not true. Many of us are working on the front line. And we also realize that an illness in the community requires a response in the community. And we want to never go back to the old normal. The old normal, historically marginalized Latinos and other communities like the Black community. So we have an opportunity to make a big difference. Some of the accomplishments of our teams have been strategies to reduce vulnerability. We push health departments and Department of Health and Human Services to publish race and ethnicity data for COVID-19. We push public health and government to produce Spanish language content, created, like I said before, infographics and videos. We did an extensive media outreach in Spanish. We are connected with the media, and immediately when we see trends and ideas coming through, we connect and try to get out there. We have written letters to the government. We have pushed for improved access to healthcare and services, including mobile testing units, improve the hotline access in Spanish. It used to be that you will call 211, and that's the COVID hotline for the state, and it will take a long time to get to speak with somebody in Spanish, and now it's a lot easier. We engage local leadership to create awareness. We improve interpreting services in intensive care unit, provided think about truly grassroots organization to help the community. And we've been training also new community health workers on the use of personal protective equipment. And then we're working with student organizations to create different teams in food insecurity, mobile testing, etc. And I'm working on a very broad response. These are just some of the different things that we've been involved with. And then we've been able to create policy change and got people from our Latin 19, and as a result, we saw that people from our Latin 19 team started getting involved in policy change and involved in the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. I want to highlight, this is extremely important, that wearing a cloth covering, either a cloth or a surgical mask, will really make a difference. I do know that we are starting to see outbreaks even at Elon, and so we really want to I cannot tell you how important it is to wear the mask, to stay 6 feet apart, to wash your hands, but most importantly, to keep that distance and wear the mask, and to be able to not be sharing the virus so broadly. Research needs to include the Latinx community. We have sent proposals to all these different organizations. We're working on manuscripts. We really often in research, Latinos have not been included, and this is really an important area to do. We want to democratize communication and information. We need to create open forums to hear and to understand how the community is doing. And we want to share information and resources. We need to build trust, create avenues for mutual respect, and to create a commitment that is not just for now, that is not just for Latino Heritage Month. So this doesn't become tokenism. This is not just for today. This is for the whole year that we're going to be paying attention to the Latinx community, and that we will engage in improving how things are happening now and for the future. In Durham, 1 in 7 children live in an immigrant family. So there is a lot of work to do, and a lot of the younger population that is starting here. I'm going to stop sharing right now, and I want to first ask some questions, and then I'm going to go back to my slides in a moment. I want to answer questions or hear questions from the audience, if that's possible.
If you want to use the Q&A option, please do so.
And I don't see any questions yet, but I would like to hear, what Jesse or Kamaria or Kia or Kyle or Leah or Linda or Nelson or Morgan or Nicole think about what I just said, and how do you see yourself engaging in improving health of different communities, and maybe in particular of the Latinx community. So Alicia Powell asks, how can the Black and Latinx community come together to bridge these gaps? I think this is a really important question, and a really important work that different community organizations need to do. First of all, Latinos can be of any race, and there is a segment of the Latinx community that is Black, but we haven't traditionally worked together. So the most important things are situations in where we should be working together, the Latinx community and the members of the African American community, some of the community-based organizations speaking to each other and seeing. I am seeing really good examples where testing events are organized, are co-organized. But I think there is a moment to think about how both these communities have been historically marginalized in North Carolina, and how important this moment is to figure out how can we come out of the margins into the center of society and to be heard. Alicia is saying, as a public health major, health disparities are so important to understand and discuss. Totally. I really, I invite every one of you to go and look at the data on health inequities from the county that you came from, or from the state where you came from, and look at what's happening with COVID right now, and see how is the Latino community being affected? How is the African American community being affected? Or you can go to there is an app where you can actually enter a zip code and see differences in inequities within your zip code also. This is important not just for those who are public health majors, but for any type of work you do. If you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to want to know how is more affected in that community. If you're going to be a doctor, you want to see that. If you're going to be a psychologist, if you're going to be a school teacher, any area of work that you may engage with in the future, you're going to want to see who in that community is being affected more or less, or who in that community is being discriminated against. Nicole says, as a Latina, I believe it starts with talking with our family, explaining to them the importance of protecting ourselves from COVID-19. I then believe as a future healthcare professional, we should have more community days where we have info tents about COVID-19 and how to properly wear PPE. Patient education is so important. Absolutely, Nicole. This is just so important, right? It's not, one of the things that I have learned the most with Latin-19 has been having a space where our community can speak and listen and be listened to, right? It doesn't help enough if I am the lecturer, but if I am the listener, to then disseminate information. The collective experiences, the Latino community are the experts in the type of lives and how COVID-19 has affected it. When I hear so much from different members of the community, whether it is Latina or non-Latino, white, Black, Latino, student, old or young, how many people are thinking that there's not so much to worry. And there isn't so much to worry until a beloved family member dies from COVID-19, until it hits us in the face or in our chest and makes us realize how serious this problem is, right? It is the day that a really healthy young person dies from COVID when it hits us as young people. It is the day that my colleague gets affected. So it's so important to understand how serious this is and how important it is that to protect each other, that we have a really important, extremely important responsibility to protect each other, to prevent it from getting worse. Kamari says, I volunteer at the Elements Open Door Clinic and we treat a lot of Spanish-speaking patients. I'm learning Spanish, but I'm not fluent, so I speak to patients in Spanish while checking them in or out, but we usually use professional interpreters during the actual appointments. Do you have any recommendations for non-Latinx Hispanic people working with Latinx and Hispanic patients in terms of cultural competency, or any other ways that we could better the Latinx and Hispanic community? The most important recommendation is, I think, to have the humility to say, no entiendo, me puede explicar, I don't understand, can you explain to me? To have an attitude of wanting to learn more and wanting to be taught, right? Even among Latinos, we're not a monolith, right? We have such a diverse group. We come from South and we come from North, South America and Central America, many are born within the US, and our experiences are just so diverse. But asking them the questions and asking them to help us guide them. Now, always the language is helpful, right? And it will help us, even if it's limited, just knowing that we care and that we try and that we're trying is always a first starting point. But I think the most important things to me, I'll just share a little story. This is many, many years ago. 25 years ago, I was a rural doctor in Iowa, in the state of Iowa. And I had delivered the first baby of a Mexican family, and they invited me to the baptism, and they really wanted me to attend. So I agreed to go to this party. And then I said, how do I get there? And we're talking, this is before cell phones were available. And they tell me, just go to this one place. And I'm married to an American, white, tall, bald American who doesn't speak any Spanish. And I went with him. And and then they told me how to get there. And you know, through a map, we found this place. And it was in the middle, literally in a small town in the middle of the cornfields of the state of Iowa. And we arrived, and it was a huge party, and it was packed with people, and men were standing in front of the walls, against the wall, watching their children and their wives dance. And a live orchestra was playing ranchera music. So my husband was post-call. He's a doctor too, and he was outside and was waiting. And he said he was just going to sleep in the car, and so that I would just go in. So I walk in and I see the party, and I meet with the family. And then the wife, the mother of the baby I delivered, actually goes outside to get my husband. So I am sitting, I'm talking with people there, and suddenly the music stops. There was complete silence. Nobody's saying a word, and everybody is looking at the door. And silently, everybody going, La migra, which means immigration. And everybody's thinking, oh my God, immigration arrived, what are we gonna do? And I say, look, it's not La migra, it's actually my husband who started standing at the door. And as he walks in, the party, the person that's invited everybody, sits him at the main table and offers him tacos. And so she tells me in Spanish, doctora, mire que los tacos son picantes. They make sure to let him know that they are spicy. And so he starts eating. So they sit him, and everybody's still silent watching. This happened in like 3 minutes. He arrived, it was all silent. They sat him down, and everybody's looking at Greg, who's sitting there. And then they serve him tacos, and he asked for salsa. And Marta says, let him know it's very spicy. And I said, it's okay. So he eats a little bit, like, no, more salsa. And then he eats very, very salsa, very picante, very spicy. And he's like, wow, quiero más, I want more. And suddenly everybody's like, oh, he's one of us. He eats like us, he's fine. And then the music started, and everybody started dancing. And it was just this beautiful moment of having realized that even if he didn't speak the language, because he loved the culture and he sat among them, and he was able to eat tacos that were extremely picante and spicy, he was welcome. So in that question, this is a very long answer with an anecdotal experience of what it means to be culturally competent. And culturally, we're never going to be completely competent. We need to be humble to ask the questions. We need to be curious to learn more. We need to be curious to try the food and enjoy and see what's there, and join in other ways of breaking bread and sitting together or eating tacos. What are some ways, if any, that we can use student talents and motivation to help our community? Nelson asks, and that's such a very important question. I think the most important way is to engage that community, use principles of community engagement, and ask the community, how do you think is the best way that I can help? In my experience as a young Latina, when I first started working with the community, there were times when the community wanted me to get engaged and highlight what was going on in regards to inequities. And there were times when the community was asking me to please stay put, because they were afraid that I was going to shed a light on a community that just was, they were working very hard, but they didn't want to be recognized and be potentially put at the mercy of immigration enforcement. Even among those who are here with legal documentation to stay, the relationship with immigration is so difficult and so mirrored with bias and fear that there are times when we just need to stay put. I think I feel very, very lucky right now that I can actually be an advisor to the government, so that our own North Carolina government, and I'm seeing that there's a way that they're recognizing the tremendous and important contributions that the Latino community is doing for the state, right? So I think it's always very important to use your talent to figure out first, ask the community, how can I help you? Is there something, teach me first, right? Go with this, no matter how highly educated we may be, is the importance of going in with the community of understanding that there's no way we're going to know how that community, what are the shoes that they feel every day, right? How tremendously hard factory work is, how hard it is to be standing on the roof putting roofing material, how hard it is to be working in a meat packing plant, doing this repetitive work for 12 hours a day, right? Let's go ask the questions and learn how is it best that I can help. The community always has a voice. Another way you can help is for that voice to be listened to. That was another thing I learned early on when I arrived as an immigrant into the US 30 years ago. I was a doctor already. I had already trained in Argentina, and I'm being recruited to family medicine residency programs. And I am sitting at a dinner table in a restaurant, and I'm hearing the people in the restaurant speaking in Spanish, right? I can hear the whole conversation. Not the restaurant, the people in the kitchen speaking in Spanish. I know that everybody in that kitchen speaks Spanish. This is a fancy, huge restaurant. And the people who are recruiting me to their practice are saying, we're so sorry, you speak Spanish, but you won't be able to use Spanish in our clinic. I said, why not? Because we don't see any Latinos in our clinic. And I'm thinking, you don't see them because you can't speak the language. I can guarantee you that the moment I arrive there, when the community knows, because this was a time when there were so few people that spoke Spanish, when they know that there's a Spanish-speaking doctor, clinician, that they will come there. And there's like, no, there are no Latinos in this neighborhood. And I'm thinking, oh my God, there's at least 20 in that kitchen, right? It's the idea that Latinos are so much part of the society, and that often is that voice. If you speak the language, augment their voices. Get those who don't speak the language to hear what they're saying. Jesse Newman says, it seems like the health disparities of marginalized and underserved communities is becoming more well known as a result of COVID-19. Do you think that as we recover from coronavirus, that we will be able to help these communities in ways we have been and continue to be failing? Jesse, I really hope, I'm working 80 hours a week on this pandemic response, for the response to not be something that's just is for now. If we go back to doing things in our state and in our country the same way that we were doing, we have failed generations of people. Half of our population is part of this historically marginalized population, and we need to do something different because we just haven't done it. All the coronavirus did was to unveil, to allow us to see the pre-existing disparities. The majority of the issues had to do with that initial slide that I show about vulnerability factors that got people that got people to be more broadly and more seriously affected by the virus, right? It is a lot easier to isolate and not transmit the virus if you are alone in your home, in a large home, than it is if you're living 7 or 8 people under the same roof. Anonymous attendee says, we often refer to this campus as the Elon bubble. Many times college students will come into communities without understanding our impact, the impact we have. Many times when we do outreach within our communities, other communities, students will come in with a hero mindset. How can we as a university community or individual students create positive change and impact the communities around us without trying to take over initiatives that are already effective? How can we support? This is probably one of the most important, every one of the questions has been important, but this is such an important question that it often happens, right? An academic center or a university is the owner of all this knowledge. And it's great because you're doing research, because you're learning. But always remember that the community has knowledge you don't have. The community is owner or of knowledge of how resilient they have been. Remember that slide that talked about zero urgency, that people, even though all of these things were happening to the Latinx community in regards to COVID-19, even though they were affected 4 times more than other communities, they still felt this wasn't urgent. Why? Because they're so resilient, because they have learned the ways of surviving in spite of all of these issues. So make sure you don't take over initiatives. Make sure you find out what's already going on. Which are the NGOs and the community organizations that are already working on this? And how can you learn and support? How can you convene? Sometimes this idea of convening. One of the things that we learned with Latin 19 was that having the Zoom capacity was something that we could provide, and convening a place for all these people to meet and all these voices to be heard, right? Creating a space where the community could actually speak and say what was going on for them, and for others who are the decision makers of the community to listen with love, to listen with respect, and to actually make the changes that are necessary at this level. One of the issues with universities is how many times, how often members of the community of historically marginalized communities are students in that school. And they either get tasked with too many things to do because they are the only ones, or they are held responsible for creating all these spaces, or they're not being put in the positions of power that are necessary. And so as a university, there's always the opportunity to say, okay, are we looking at this? Are there equitable places? How many faculty are hired to these positions who are actually members of these historically marginalized communities, right? So those are just some of the other things that can be done. Any other questions or comments that I may be missing? Sorry, my dog always wants to talk when I'm talking, so you might be hearing my little dog going. I don't see more questions, so I can, unless Silvia Munoz, if Dr. Munoz has a question for me, otherwise I can share my ending slides. Is that okay? So you might be thinking where to start. It can be overwhelming, and some of you already asked this question. And there's so much that can be done in the issue of health disparities and health inequities. So paying attention to where can we start is so important. You can start small. You can, join our calls, for example, on Wednesdays at noon. Or you can start supporting Latino communities. Uh, Instead of eating from a big chain, start eating, buying tacos from a community-based organization that makes tacos. You can start following different groups that are representative of Latinos on Twitter, for example, or look at what's going on in regards to the pandemic. You can go to a medium level and create educational opportunities for yourselves as a team, as a group, and create learning opportunities so that everybody is this idea of democratizing information, getting the information out to the community and listening to the community. You want to be curious. If you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, when you're hearing what's going on in your community, be curious. What was said there? Call out the inequities, call out the disparities, okay? You want to share concerns. You want to share and be heard. You can go big. You can find out, this is just one of the community organizations, find out what community organizations are doing and see how you can contribute to that community organization. This is just one example, the Scholar Academy for Latinx United for Diversity, which was started by a medical student at Duke, bringing into our university students who are Latinos in high school in the area into the learning processes in the university to be able to aspire to becoming a student. And then for the leaders in the room, whether you are a student leader or a faculty leader, I say to you, who are the members there? Who is being heard? Who is part of this community? And are those whose voices are different being heard? And then I say muchas gracias, and I will stop sharing again and ask if there is any last 8-minute question.
I don't think anybody's writing more questions. But I really want to thank you for taking the time to join us. Thank you so much for all that important information that you shared with us, for the advice, for the stories. I think that storytelling is very important and very relevant in understanding, especially when we're talking about the Latinx Hispanic community and becoming a little bit more intercultural aware, right? So thank you so much again for being with us today. I also want to thank everybody that participated today. And at 6 o'clock, we have our next session. I invite you to stay with us, take a 5-minute break, stretch a little bit, go and get away from the computer for a minute, and join us again at 6. We have an interesting panel on immigration, another hot topic and another very important topic to learn about, to think about, and to hear different perspectives as well. So again, thank you to everybody for joining us. And thank you, Doctora Martinez, for being with us today. Appreciate it.
Un gusto. Thank you. Muchísimas gracias a ustedes.
Gracias.
think in broader terms, I think recently something that happened, well, not as recently as certainly the issues in Irwin, but in February, the Trump administration promulgated new public charge rules, which we've seen have a major chilling effect on immigrants who potentially would otherwise apply for immigration benefits. And the impact has, at least that we've seen, has been disproportionately on the Hispanic and Latinx community, as those are oftentimes communities that are participating in more of a family-based immigration system and fear that they will be punished somehow for accessing things that are not considered under the rules, such as free school lunches or community health programs, has certainly been disappointing to see, because it really discourages people from accessing services that they are allowed to receive under the public charge rule, and which are really beneficial for their families. So those are kind of like the two, I think, that have been highlighted in the news. Well, I should say, and I can't forget DACA. DACA, of course, and I know we're going to talk about that a little later, as a huge issue. And we're seeing right now, we've started filing initial DACA cases. They've all been rejected so far. And I think that that's a huge gap in our immigration system as far as our treatment of these young people. And I mean, even DACA is not perfect. You know, it doesn't create a path to permanent status for people. And so those, I think, are kind of the big three in the news. And I certainly don't want to harp on this too long, but I will say that our immigration laws, the majority of them were implemented in 1996, and we have a very different country now than we did in 1996. And so we see delays in processing times in both USCIS, which is the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, and Immigration Court, visa backlogs, permanent bar system, and 3 and 10 year bars, and the travel bans from Trump. All these things are antiquated and are not functioning well. And so I find that for our clients who are primarily from the Hispanic and Latinx community, it's just it's a barrier at every turn. And so that's my too long-winded answer for what are key immigration issues facing the U.S.
Thank you. Man?
Thank you, Ms. Vanessa and Ms. Emily, for the input. So I think there's a lot of immigration issues, especially in Alamance County. I'm a resident, and I come from a family of Mexican immigrants. So we come from a lot of oppression here in Alamance County, especially the law or the contract 287G that has actually been fought by different organization groups here in North Carolina. So even locally, we haven't reached to that extent of immigration oppression and stuff like that. And we can actually see that there's mass funding of detention centers by public and private institutions, trying to keep our people and just our fellow people, just trying to get in detention centers and stuff like that. Also, the media shows a great light on what's actually happening inside the detention centers as people speak out and how they're treated afterwards and stuff like that. And yeah.
Enrique?
Of course. Thanks so much for having me, Vanessa, and all the other panelists. It's great to be here this evening to chat about an incredibly important topic that for me is more personal than anything. I'm certainly running for political office right now as a state representative. Unfortunately, that position doesn't hold as much weight in this conversation around immigration policy, where a lot of it is relegated to the local level, like Manny mentioned, around decisions that our county commissioners are making around 287G, and things happening at the national level that Emily covered that are happening around our immigration policy at large. I will say, though, that for me, the key issue is what it's always been, right? Is how do we create a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million people that are here in this country undocumented? It feels like, especially in the last administration, we have moved the goalpost around how we talk about immigration and what the challenges are. Certainly DACA is a challenge, and sort of where young people find themselves sort of in limbo now as we continue to play politics with their livelihoods. Certainly sort of challenges around 287G are also challenges at the local level. But so much of this is product of a conversation that we continue to kick the can down the road around what do we do with families that have lived in the United States at this point for 10, 20, maybe even 25, 30 years and still do not have a pathway to citizenship. the narrative that has been created around immigration is that we're talking about folks that have been recently arriving in North Carolina and the United States in the last few years. And certainly that's been the focal point of our media and what's been happening with crises in Central America. But at the end of the day, the majority of the families that we see every day in our school systems, students that we work with, whether the students are undocumented or have DACA or citizens, we're talking about families that have been as part of our fabric of our communities for so long. And I would love to find a way, as sort of this political climate hopefully cools down after the elections, and we have potentially a more immigrant inclusive climate, and thinking about how do we actually bring in these hundreds of thousands of families across North Carolina and across the nation, millions of families across the nation, into the social fabric of our community and allow them to come out of the shadows in a way that really benefits everyone in our country. I think that we've seen time and time again that, as Vanessa mentioned, many times this issue is politicized. It's interesting that as the focus has shifted now to other issues of racial injustice and issues like the pandemic and our economic collapse due to the pandemic, that all of a sudden immigrants aren't a problem anymore, and we're not no longer sort of running away from this crisis, right? Supposedly they were, crossing our border and about to destroy this country, but now all of a sudden the problem has disappeared, right? And so I think that changing the narrative and focusing on the actual challenges that we face and thinking of solutions is sort of what I think about when I think about key immigration issues right now.
Thank you. So Manny mentioned the media and Ricky spoke about narratives. So as a follow-up question, do you think that the public is getting a good idea of the issues around immigration, meaning our stories like family separation and the controversies of ICE detention centers practices shaping the narrative, or are these topics taking a second place in lieu of all the other things going on in the country?
Well, from my perspective, as an immigration attorney, I think that there's widespread misunderstanding of the current state of immigration law. I still encounter clients and oftentimes U.S. citizen spouses of clients who think that there's some magical line that if you can get into this line that you're going to get your status lickety split, and that is not the scenario. Even for people that can get in a line, it's a multi-year process. If it even becomes that with coronavirus and with the backlogs, both at the government level and in the immigration courts, we're seeing things move at a glacial pace. And so I think something that we as immigration attorneys are continuously frustrated by is this sense on the general public that if immigrants would just do what they're supposed to, we wouldn't have a problem. And as Ricky mentioned, the system is outdated, and it doesn't function like that. And it is also frustrating because I think something we've seen a lot in the Trump administration is that the immigration is played up as an emergency when it is convenient to score political points. And I think that it is frustrating to see how successful that is. And that to me seems like a misunderstanding of immigration, that there's some sort of sense that every time the president says we've got to close the border, that must mean that something new has happened. And really it's the same as it's always been. And as Ricky mentioned, and there's also people who've been here a long time we're not considering at all. And so I think definitely there's a widespread misunderstanding of that current state of immigration law. And I will let the other panelists kind of speak more broadly as the community thinks, but I'll just add this. I was struck last week when the news broke about the hysterectomies that occurred in Irwin. The major news outlets did not have these as breaking news. These were down on the page. This was no CBS and ABC and the Washington Post. No one thought this is a headline. These occurred further down the page. You had to scroll. And so if you're a casual consumer of major news outlets, you weren't necessarily going to get that unless you actually scroll down, or unless a friend shared it on social media, or you listen to the radio. And to me, I think that's really telling as far as what we place value in our media, that just this colossal abuse of human rights was not seen as breaking news. And so I think it can be very disheartening.
Thank you. Manny?
Yeah, just like how Miss Emily mentioned that it wasn't on main media streams, but a lot of times, well, that I saw, it was on my social media, and I think the youth could really impact and make a difference. Just like start seeing what's really going on, and that way joining political parties or political organizations that help communities, that help like immigration rights and stuff like that. And I'm really glad that I've influenced others into opening up to like what's really going on. And I think the social media is a good impact and shining light on what's really going on.
Thank you. Ricky?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with a lot of what Emily and Manny have said in terms of the narrative that we're painting. And I certainly don't, when I talk about wanting to change, not change, but shift the narrative back to so many of the core issues that are impacting families that have been here for a long time, that doesn't necessarily take away from the atrocities and the human rights abuses that are happening in these ICE detention centers. I absolutely think that that is deserving of breaking news, and it certainly should be highlighted, because what has been happening at the border the last few years, as well as what we're learning is happening in places like Stewart Detention Center in Georgia, is atrocious. And these sort of private detention centers, as part of a broader system of mass incarceration, have been largely a black box to so many people. We don't know what goes on inside of them. And so for these stories to be coming out and for whistleblowers to be shining light on these abuses, I think is an important part in us moving forward and figuring out how do we keep these institutions accountable, and how do we make sure this never, ever happens again. I do, sort of unrelated to that though, I think it's, how do we get back to where we were, right? In terms of like the more boring conversation around sort of the challenges that immigrant families sort of face every day, right? And I think until we really begin thinking big picture again, and move away from simply the DACA narrative around they're the only ones that need support. Well, what about their parents, right? I think that is certainly part of the narrative that I would like to see sort of brought back into the limelight, because I think it is a core part of where our immigration system needs to go in the coming years.
I appreciate very much that you highlighted, all of you, the hysterectomies story, because at any other point, any other year, that would have been a major, major, major scandal. And in part is because things are so dysfunctional in this country as we speak, that there are so many other things going on that it takes a backside, but also it shows also who matters and who matters less in the news agenda. And I say that as a journalist and as a public relations practitioner. And I also want to bring back what Emily, I think, was saying, that yes, there's not a magical line to become an immigrant, to become a US citizen. There are very few categories under which people can apply to become a citizen. And if you don't fit one of those few categories, there's no way for you. There's no line for you. You cannot go back and get in line to become a citizen. I wanted to highlight that because maybe some of the participants are very well informed about the process, but maybe some are not. And for example, I am an immigrant in this country, and I had one category under which I actually could qualify. And thank God, because otherwise I wouldn't have my situation in a regular status right now. But even I, who had the possibility of going through that particular category, and I have education, I have certain means, I have certain social networks, support. And with all the process and all the things in line, it took me 8 years, for example, to become a citizen. So just to throw that out there so that people realize that is not an easy process. Most people cannot even apply. And even if you do, it can take you decades to go through the process, and a process like that is simply not working. So thank you very much for your answers. You also mentioned DACA, so let me move to that topic. could each of you please briefly explain what you know about DACA and what is its current status? What are some immigration laws in place that currently put DACA students or international students at risk? And let's start with Emily again.
Sure. So I'll definitely touch on the legal side. So in this past June, the Supreme Court kind of surprised us and upheld DACA. Essentially, the reason for upholding DACA was because the Trump administration, in trying to rescind DACA, didn't follow the necessary procedures under what otherwise people never think about, which is the Administrative Procedures Act. It's a law that's designed to regulate how agencies make and promulgate rules. And part of that act determines how agencies roll back programs. And because DACA is a program administered by the Department of Justice, which is, the Department of Homeland Security, which is an executive agency, they're subject to following the prescribed procedures under the Administrative Procedures Act. And the Trump administration did not follow those when DACA was rescinded. So as far as where we stand now, we're in a little bit of a limbo legally. For right now, DACA stands. We're currently nationwide, essentially in a fight with USCIS, which is our agency. The acting secretary of DHS is Chad Wolf. He issued a policy memorandum that says, hey, yeah, we heard the Supreme Court's decision, but we're not going to accept initial DACA applications because we don't think we have to. And we're going to limit the period of validity for renewals to only 1 year when it used to be 2. And we'll reinstate advanced parole, but only for people in exceptional circumstances. And so the agency is essentially trying to get around what the Supreme Court ordered, which was DACA stands as it was before it was rescinded. And so what we're seeing now is across the country is there's several class actions. Individual immigration practitioners are suing the government to try and force the government to accept initial DACA applications, because there are all these people who qualify for DACA, but who became eligible right as the program was rescinded or thereafter, who are eager to receive these benefits. But because the government's refusing to accept initial requests, the only way to even have a hope of getting or being considered for DACA, not even receiving it, just having your application considered, is to sue in federal court. And so that's what we're looking at with several of our clients. It's a very scary prospect for clients. Most of people we're working with are young high school students who are used to, kind of living under the radar, and the idea of having to go to federal court and stand up and fight for this is really scary. But the benefits of DACA are tremendous if you've previously been undocumented. So that's kind of the current status. The other thing that is possible is that the Trump administration could try to rescind DACA following the procedures of the Administrative Procedures Act, which is essentially what the Supreme Court said they would have to do. But there's no barrier to them doing that. We don't expect them to do it before the election because we think that the political capital of that would not be so negative for Trump that even he's not willing to risk the quote-unquote Latinx vote. But we'll see. It's certainly a possibility, and if he is reelected, I think it's a very real possibility. Otherwise, there's not really any immigration laws that are in place to provide similar protections for students and individuals who are currently documented. We don't see, there's so many barriers, even for people who have married U.S. citizens, to applying for status, that there's not really anything comparable or a good solution for these students. So it's a major issue.
Thank you very much. Manny?
Thank you. So a little bit is thankfully that I'm a citizen, so I don't have DACA, but I do have family friends that are DACA recipients. So I do know that when Donald Trump or the Trump administration tried to counteract DACA, they were intimidated and they kind of felt bad about like the possible like retention of DACA and stuff like that. But to my knowledge, I'm not too informed about like what's going on with DACA. So yeah.
That's fine. Ricky.
Yeah. Don't worry, man. That's why we get a lawyer on the panel. She'll tell us everything going on. She'll give us the legalese, right? Yeah, I mean, I'll take it from a different perspective because Emily did a good job of giving us sort of a good overview of where DACA stands, right? Essentially, right, in 2012, President Obama issued an executive order that created this program, and the Trump administration tried, it was just as easy to take it away as it was to introduce it. It was never anything permanent. It was a Band-Aid solution to the deeper immigration problems in our nation, but certainly at least created a window of hope, a window of opportunity for many young people in particular to gain their voices, to gain sort of their footing in our country, and really think about what this means for their future and their family's future. A lot of what people don't realize who aren't as familiar with these issues or part of the community is that DACA was a lifeline to not just individuals, but the families. DACA recipients are usually the only ones in their family who have work authorization and who have the freedom to move in the state of North Carolina because they have access to a driver's license when their parents may not. They're the only ones that could potentially purchase a home in a place like North Carolina or across the nation, right? And be able to sort of have access to the same sort of resources that other people do. Their pathway to higher education is slightly easier, but not much. Because of having DACA, that doesn't necessarily guarantee you access to financial aid, and you still have to pay out-of-state tuition if you have DACA. And so all of these issues certainly show you that there's benefits to DACA, but not necessarily the full purview of benefits that any U.S. citizen has. I do believe that now, moving forward, we have to think about what this cloud hanging over people's head has meant over the last few years. It has really taken such a huge toll on our community. I see this every day. I work in education. That's my full-time job. Work at UNC Chapel Hill, and I work in the community doing college access work. And so in doing that work, you really begin to see sort of how our government, our federal government, has broken a social contract with people who had faith in stepping forward and say, I'm here, I'm coming out of the shadows, and I'm giving you essentially the story of my life in a document, right? Fingerprints, addresses, third grade report cards, whatever it might be, right? To be able to prove that you're here and you want to live here in good faith. To qualify for DACA, you had to have a spot clean record, and you have to renew it every 2 years. And now I believe, Emily, it's every year now. They changed it. And so the fact that it was costly and they had to be on perfect behavior, this is the best of the best. Look, the kids who have DACA that are in college are smarter than any other kids on the block. They've had to work so hard to get there, and they're busting their tails to really make sure that they, have a future in this country. Unfortunately, since this rescission, I've had so many heartbreaking stories. I was just sending messages with a former student of mine who actually decided to leave the country. She was sick of it. She had DACA. She graduated from an incredible private university here in North Carolina, but still was locked out of opportunity and was tired of living in fear. So she moved to Mexico and is going to go study in Europe for her graduate degree. She said, I just can't live in this fear anymore. And so when I think about the prospect of losing young people like that, who could be the next CEO of Lenovo here in North Carolina, or the president of your next foundation, but folks are just tired of living in this climate. We actually can't afford as a state to lose these young people. In 10 years, we're going to be 500,000 people short in fulfilling jobs in North Carolina. A lot of people don't know that. 500,000 jobs that go unfulfilled because people don't have the college education necessary if we don't do something about it. But we're happily letting these incredible people go that want to be a part of our community, that want to be a part of North Carolina. And so this is very much my soapbox. And so I will step off of it because I love these young kids. I've worked with them for years now. And what's the trials and tribulations they have to go through in high school to even have a shot in college and to be able to sort of be a part of the fabric of our community is really heartbreaking to sort of hear the stories. And so what's happening with DACA is one of the biggest failures, moral failures, I think, of our country, to sort of politicize their lives and to throw them around like a political football. I think we should all just be ashamed of where we've come to in that conversation.
So in a moment, I'm going to move to talk about the Latinx community and COVID, for example, and the Latinx community and 287G. But there is a question in the Q&A that I want to address because Shayna Mejas is asking about the government rescinding TPS, the temporary protected status, which for me is one more very obvious gesture that this government is not against undocumented immigration, which I think, to start with, these are human beings who need a pathway and a system. But I think the government is really against immigrants of a particular type, not all immigrants, right? So this temporary protected status protects thousands of people from deportation in from countries such as El Salvador and Haiti. And this has lasted for many years, and now it's being stopped. So can you refer to that as well, if you're so kind?
Yes, I think it's an excellent question. I mean, TPS was one of the first things that the Trump administration targeted. And I agree with you, Vanessa. I think it definitely is indicative of the Trump administration's kind of greater plans to weed out, like, quote unquote, undesirable immigrants. It's the same reason why the public charge rule was introduced in February, or implemented in February of this year, in this effort to kind of limit who's allowed to be here by wealth. And I think that TPS recipients we're seeing oftentimes are from, well, I won't use the term that the president has used to describe them, but they're from countries that are less prominent, seen as less prestigious, and they've been here for a long time. And I think there's this perception that they've been here long enough. If they haven't figured out something by now, so be it. And it's been devastating. I was Googling while you were introducing the question, and I mean, the last count was about 317,000 people who have TPS, who are all set to be without status in January of 2021. And it's very nerve-wracking. We have one of the things that we've been doing over the past few months is systematically going through re-interviewing all our TPS clients to see, do you have anything else that we can do? A lot of clients are considering filing late asylum claims if they don't have anything else, and the majority don't, because it's, as Vanessa mentioned earlier, it's very, very limited. And something a lot of people don't know is, even if you have a U.S. citizen child, which many people do at this point, depending on how you entered, you may be required to return to your home country to process your case. And if you were here for more than 180 days, you've accrued unlawful presence time, which means that when you leave the United States, you're going to trigger either a 3 or 10-year bar. And if you don't have a U.S. citizen spouse or parent, there's no waiver for you for that bar. So many times we have clients who come in who say, oh, I've got a 21-year-old United States citizen child, and that's great. But then we run into this issue that that's not actually a path for you if it's not realistic for you to stay in your home country for 3 or for 10 years to serve that bar. So the rescission of TPS is one of, unfortunately, many things the Trump administration has done, I think, to target kind of immigrants that are viewed as low income and undesirable. And it's a serious issue. And we have a webinar next week with the American Immigration Lawyers Association, which is our professional association that's exclusively practitioners brainstorming to brainstorm creative ideas of ways we can come up with ways for people to end up with some sort of status. But it's going to be very limited, and it's not going to meet the need that we actually have. It's not going to create status for 317,000 people. So it's a serious issue that we don't have a good solution for.
Thank you. I don't know if Manny or Ricky would like to add something.
Well, I'll just say that just like a lot of recipients of TPS are from Salvadorian or Honduran descent. And a good word that Emily said was asylum. And they're here seeking asylum from like the violence or just corruption going on in their countries, and bringing them back to that country would mainly fear for their life or just stuff like that. So yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, Manny. Absolutely. I think that for me, when I think about TPS, I do think about sort of similar remarks I made about DACA, right? In terms of just a moral failure of our communities, of our society, that we're even in this position. I think that people have to understand sort of what this looks like in practice, and to sort of it would be one thing if the TPS recipients had been here for maybe 1-2 years, where it truly was temporary. Then maybe the government might have a case to say, we helped you get back on your feet. Now it's time to go back home. But we know that's not actually how it's played out in practice. These are countries that have suffered natural disasters, and in places like Haiti and El Salvador that suffered hurricanes and earthquakes. We're in shambles, and in many ways are still in shambles. And so there wasn't much to go back to. The federal government, in continuing to renew TPS for these recipients, some who have been here in the country for 20 years at this point, I believe, again, made a social contract with these folks, right? What do you expect people who are given 20 years grace to live in a country? What do you expect them to do, right? They get mortgages, they raise families, they're part of our communities. And now all of a sudden you're saying, just kidding, you got to go home. Like, what do you do with that? And so it doesn't just impact the families that are now suffering under this cloud of uncertainty. It also impacts our community as we think about all of these folks who have invested their time, energy, and resources into building places like North Carolina. Now all of a sudden they're being asked to leave, and I think that's unconscionable.
Thank you. And also, you mentioned natural disasters. There are also situations of the consequences of civil war and violence. And yes, we in Central America, we are very good at creating problems. I recognize that, but it's important, especially if you're a student and you're listening, to also think and learn about the impact of a country like the United States in the situation in Central America and South America. So just Google US intervention in Central America, and you will learn a lot. Please use reliable sources, but Google that and you will see that my country, the US, which is also my country, has contributed to the situation there. And the TPS is a way really to try to give some restitution to people who really need it. Let me jump, I'm gonna come back to COVID if we have time, because the previous panel was about health and the Latinx community, but I wanna talk about the program 287G, which is a program that Alamance County subscribes to through the sheriff's office. And I wanted to ask you, that locally and recently there have been some news stories about 287G. Can you please explain what that is and what that means for the Latinx community locally?
Sure. Well, I will definitely take the legal part of it, and I will leave Manny and Ricky to really speak to community impact. So 287G essentially allows local police officers to act as agents of ICE. So the federal government, ICE, and local police officers or local departments, sheriff's offices, what have you, enter into what's called memorandums of agreement, and whereby the local officers are deputized and can perform the same functions as an ICE officer. So they can inspect someone for immigration documents, they can issue a notice to appear for immigration court, they can transfer people into ICE custody. And so essentially it creates, from a legal perspective, it creates these hotspots where residents or anyone traveling through is more likely to be apprehended by ICE and end up in removal proceedings and put at a higher risk of deportation. And the disparate impact is very severe because, as you mentioned, Alamance is a very aggressive county in terms of immigration enforcement. They have been for many years. But it essentially means that citizens, or not citizens, but immigrants across North Carolina, depending on where you live, are exposed to different levels of risk, which is inherently unfair. And so that's the legal perspective. I'll leave community impact to Ricky and Manny.
So yeah, 287G has affected the Hispanic, Latino community. Just as growing up for me, I remember that there would be like checkpoints for license, and especially like in Hispanic communities where they would know that nobody there would have a license. And from there, they would be taken to the Graham detention center, background checked, and ultimately deported to like a detention center in Georgia and from there deported. So really 287G instills fear in the Hispanic community, and it still does, and it's still oppressing our people, separating families. In the community level, well, Mi Gente and Siembra has been fighting against it, and we help people that are actually there. We communicate with the families, try to help with support and stuff like that, and people are actually scared to go to work, and yeah.
Thank you. And the work that Siembra does is amazing. So I encourage everybody to check them out on online. Not only you can be a volunteer, but you can donate and you can participate in their programs. It's a really great organization. Ricky?
Yeah, and I'm thankful for folks like Manny who are on the front lines and supporting families across Alamance County as they continue to face challenges of family separation due to programs like 287G. I would say, like, backing up and just really thinking about what is the intent, what is the purpose of a program like 287G. I mean, Alamance County is not alone in collaborating with ICE. If the intent is public safety and public trust, it certainly fails on both of those fronts. It's created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation, a power dynamic that has really forced a community back into the shadows as they think about am I safe here, right? And I think that ultimately leads to even worse outcomes when it comes to public safety, because now you have families, you have mothers, fathers who are unwilling to cooperate with pretty simple investigations as we think about sort of crime in our community in general, right? And so if something were to happen in the household, say something of domestic abuse or other incidents in the community, immigrant families are less likely to report on those things because they are fearful of the repercussions of coming in contact with any sort of law enforcement. And so I think that a program like 287G has been great to politicize an issue such as immigration and to really continue to divide us rather than really think about what are the issues that are really impacting our community. And so I don't see certainly a need for it. It doesn't accomplish its goals as intended. And there's certainly a better way of garnering trust and making sure that all of our communities are safe. And so I certainly hope that we continue moving forward in Alamance County with a solution that actually helps everyone and stops with this fear mongering of who's making us less safe, which is certainly not the case. And you can just look at the data to sort of see that crime rates in immigrant communities across North Carolina, across the nation, are actually less. They're lower than in native-born populations. And so that narrative, is pretty largely debunked pretty quickly, but we also know that that has been a tool that's been used from the top all the way down in terms of politicizing and fear-mongering among our communities today.
Thank you very much for that, because we have many Latinos in the community who happen to be undocumented, and in that way, they are, let's say, breaking the law in that regard. But otherwise, they are working hard, they are trying to help their families, raise their children, and they are afraid to take them to school, to go shopping, to just move around because a stop by the police can result in deportation and breaking of families, etc. I would say that while not perfect, the Burlington Police Department is trying to be close to the community and understand the circumstances. And I would say that Chief Smythe has been good about that. I will not expand much, but I cannot say the same about the sheriff's office.
Can I follow up on that, actually, Vanessa? I think you're right. I think I was using law enforcement in generic terms, right? But certainly the Burlington Police Department has been fantastic in really building trust in our communities and really thinking about how do we ensure public safety for everyone in our community. So I certainly think that is very true, Vanessa. I wanted to back up and just sort of say one more quick thing is I worked with a few doctors across North Carolina to write a paper, actually, to really look at what is the consequences to programs like 287G. And it goes beyond just public safety. When it's exactly what you mentioned, Vanessa, in terms of educational outcomes and the social emotional health of our children. they know what's happening, and they see the fear that their families are living in every day. What does that do for toxic stress and trauma in our children's lives as we plan for their future? They have been suffering under this cloud of uncertainty and fear, worse now more than ever over the last 4 years under this Trump administration. And when you think about the health outcomes overall, right, beyond just toxic stress and trauma that families suffer, you also think about just physical health, right? Just folks are less likely to go to the doctor, to the community clinic, because that might be, 45 minutes away in rural Alamance County. And folks aren't going to risk that. And they'd rather have a cold, stay home. If it's something serious, they'll risk it because they know that the consequences on the other side are far more dire.
And that's an amazing connection to what probably is going to be our last question, because it's 6:50. And I would say maybe we can take 6-7 more minutes and then we have to move to the next topic. But the next question is about COVID and how has the pandemic affected immigrants in general, but specifically those who identify as Latinx or Hispanic, and it's very much related to what you just said. If we can maybe start with Emily, go around, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. Well, for better or for worse, I don't have a ton to say about this topic because I'm not a member of the community. Of course, I'm an ally, but I don't think it's appropriate for me to kind of project my impressions upon the community without having that kind of firsthand knowledge. I'll say as far as the legal perspective goes, we've seen that our clients struggle to continue with their cases, which is absolutely a burden of COVID that I think is overlooked. That for those who are lucky enough to have a path to status and to be working on a case, to be impacted by this disease and be prevented from collecting the documents you need or being able to pay to move forward. It's very expensive to file these fees. The government charges exorbitant fees. The impact has been very extreme, and it just oftentimes makes what's already a long, arduous process that much worse. So I'll leave the rest to Manny and Ricky.
Thank you, Ms. Emily. So I think the pandemic has affected Hispanic or Latino communities a lot greater, just loss of jobs. A lot of folks that I know or just family members or friends are kind of scared to get COVID tested before, just because they thought it could lead to some kind of immigration or deportation of like getting information and stuff like that, or seeking government assistance and still going to work. And yeah, so it has affected them greatly.
Yeah, it's been certainly something that we know COVID-19 has impacted everyone. We are fully aware of that, but it has not impacted anyone more than the Latino community. You see rates of positive tests for coronavirus sort of skyrocket through the roof in many counties. I haven't checked the recent numbers in Alamance in a few weeks, but I know for a very long time, over 50% of the cases were in the Latino community in Alamance County. In Durham, I think they were above 70%, I dare say, 75%. And so certainly an incredibly high percentage. Across the state, we were, I think, somewhere between 40 and 50% of the cases, even though we're only about 10% of the population statewide. And so, we sort of, that begs the question, why? And I think certainly the conditions in which immigrants and Latinos find themselves is certainly sort of the root cause of this issue, where Latinos never stopped, right? We are the front lines. We feed North Carolina, we feed the world, right? In many ways, working at the meat poultry plants that are, right now have seen many outbreaks across North Carolina in this time of the coronavirus, working in the fields, right? Working really difficult jobs, working in our restaurants, in construction, in places where they aren't typically enforcing safety protocols as much, and where they haven't had the luxury of social distancing and things of that nature. There was also a recent study out of Harvard last week that I was listening to that pointed to another issue that I think we all know very well in the Latino community, which is multi-generational households. And so many people it's a different sort of living arrangements, right? Where more than one family may live in the same occupancy, and so that may mean that if one person gets sick, many more people may get sick at the same time, and so you sort of combine all these factors together, and you sort of get what we have right now, which is a community that's been disproportionately impacted by something that requires increase in protections in the workplace and social distancing, which we really can't afford in this moment. And then you sort of exacerbate that issue by excluding many Latino and immigrant families from any sort of relief. Even we saw sort of the impact of something like the CARES Act, where many families received relief checks, but many families that were in mixed status households did not. Because even if one person in that household was undocumented, they received no relief money, which is pretty incredible that they would target it that narrow, right? When they want to pay attention, they certainly do, right? And so, the folks are hurting, losing jobs, unemployment rates are higher in the Latino community as well. And so it's certainly something that we're going to continue seeing the repercussions of for many, many months to come as we continue to navigate this pandemic and see what the fallout is next year as well.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Emily, Manny, and Ricky for taking time of their days to talk to us about these very, very important topics. If you care about these issues, if you care about the fact that we have children in jail right now in this country, that we are performing hysterectomies on women without their consent. If you care about these issues, remember that this is a very important moment. Today is National Voter Registration Day. Please, if you have not registered to vote, do so. Check that you are actually registered. Check where you're supposed to vote. If you're an Elon student and maybe you are not registered here in this state, think about what you're going to do in terms of requesting mail-in ballot or changing your registration place. This is the time because the deadlines are approaching. You vote in any way you want, obviously, but I think that there are candidates locally and nationally who are supporting the Latino community and the issues of the Latino community, which are the issues of the American community as well. I hope that you're aware that 18% of the population in the United States are Latinos, and actually more than 70% of them are born and raised in the United States, as American as you can get. So this is our community, not the other. So I really want to thank you all. We have 2 minutes to stop, leave, and there is another session, a very good session at 7 p.m. So please stick around, and thank you again for participating. We appreciate, Elon University appreciates the time that Emily, Manny, and Ricky have taken to be with us. And we thank again the CREED and El Centro for organizing the events for Hispanic Heritage Month. And let me transfer to Sylvia now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Emily, Ricky, Manny, and Vanessa for taking time today to talk to us a little bit about such an important topic. As Vanessa said, we have another presentation in a couple of minutes. It's a very interesting presentation by Daison Pasion. I think that we have talked about health, we talked about immigration, and in all of that, in all of those two topics, education has come up as well. It's a very, very important issue that connects to all the conversations we have had today. So stay tuned. We are going to start in 1 minute. Again, thank you, Emily, Ricky, Manny, for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Again, thank you so much for staying with us. I'm sure that there's going to be probably more people joining us. Daison, welcome, and thank you for being with us today. I'm going to hand it over to Jalise. Jalise is going to introduce our next speaker and our last speaker. And again, just to remind you that we have the Q&A box. You can ask any questions through there.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Latinx, Hispanic, and the education system. So today I'm going to be introducing Daison Pacion. Daison Pacion graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2010 with a degree in biology. During his undergraduate tenure, Pacion enrolled in the UNC Baccalaureate Education in Science and Teaching program, completing all requirements to teach secondary science in North Carolina. During his time with ABSS, Pacion served the community as a science teacher, STEM educator and coordinator, instructional technology facilitator, and academic coach. Pacion currently serves as an equity specialist in the Office of Equity and Inclusion for Chapel Hill Carrboro City Schools. He also serves on the board of Immersion for Spanish Acquisition, is a member of Elon University's School of Education Advisory Board for middle grades, is a co-founder of Alamance for Ed, and is a graduate of the inaugural class of the Alamance Teacher Leadership Academy. Daison remains an active alumnus of the Keenan Fellows Program for Educational Leadership and is a current member of educational organizations, including the North Carolina First in Teaching Leaders, North Carolina Association of Educators, Teaching in Color, EduColor, and several additional professional organizations.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Yalis, and thank you, Sylvia. So my name is Daison Pacion. I'm an educator in the Chapel Hill Carrboro City Schools. And I just want to talk a little bit today about, sorry, I got a message in my screen. Sorry about my battery, but I'm good. I just want to talk a little bit today about the educational barriers and opportunities, especially from a Latinx and Hispanic perspective. I think before I can really share some of the barriers and opportunities, though, that you need to know sort of a little bit about me and my perspective. So when we discuss inequities in our educational system, it's important to really know our personal stories and our perspectives and our lived experiences, so that you know where we're coming from. So I'm going to share a little bit about myself, since yeah, I identify as Latino. I was a student in these systems, and now an educator in these systems. So that's my perspective. But like I said, my name is Daison Pacion. I identify as brown and Latinx. I use the pronouns he, him, and el. I was born in Queens, New York. My family moved down to North Carolina in the early 90s, right at the beginning of the Latino population boom here in North Carolina. So I moved from New York City and went to school in rural Alamance County, specifically Southern Middle and Southern High School. I moved down around the 6th grade, and that was a huge culture shock. So I introduced myself right as Daison Pacion. If you knew me back then, I probably would have introduced myself to you as Daison, right? So one thing that I really had to do in order to survive this new environment was quickly assimilate to the dominant culture, right? And by doing that, that stripped away parts of my identity that I think many of our Latino students are facing now. So having to anglicize my name, right? It wasn't until recently that I really, reclaimed my identity and reclaimed my name. I lost a lot of my language. Spanish was my first language that I learned, but now it's hard for me to speak and be in conversation in Spanish, and it's something that that I truly think about and wonder how could an educational system, right, and the environment that it created aid in the loss of one of my languages. And it felt very othering as a student. And then it wasn't until like in high school that even progressed even more to where I wanted to hide and strip away parts of my culture. In college, it wasn't really until I became a teacher that I did my own identity work, racial and ethnic identity work, and that was because I was teaching students who looked like me and had similar experiences to me, and this was 20 years after I had gone through the system. So really looking at, 20 years later, these problems still persist and nothing is being done. So that's when I really started, that's when I really became activated and thinking about what are these disparities that are happening in our system, and how does race and ethnicity play into that. So let's start with some data, right? This is from the Racial Equity Report Card. It's a report that the Southern Coalition in Social Justice puts out every year, and they look at different outcomes in our educational system. They look at academic achievement. They look at discipline. They look at teacher-student demographics. But in this, and just looking at academic achievement, and of course, end of grade scores are really not a measure of student success or of student learning, but it is a data point that is often used for decision making that will affect students. So that's why I bring these up. And here you see, so the Latino students are in green for Alamance County. That there is a disparity between the achievement of Latino students and a gap between the Latino students and the average, as well as Latino students versus white students. And there's many things that could go into that. There are many barriers that Latino students face in our education system, from lack of teacher diversity, lack of representation in curriculum and instruction material, over-identification in exceptional children programming, underrepresentation in academically and intellectually gifted programming, underrepresentation in honors and advanced placement courses. We see many outcomes in these inequities, and they come from systemic barriers in place. So policies and structures in these institutions that really marginalize many of our students. One of the big ones that I've been looking at recently is language access, especially during COVID, right? When we're wanting to inform our families of updates quickly, and when we're in fully remote instruction, for some of our families in not their native language, and having to assist their children, looking at language access. There's this one instance from earlier this year, before COVID, when it was a winter closure, right? And the district sends out an alert on social media, but it's only in English. And then there are, if you see on the screenshots, there are community members who ask in the future if there can be translation provided. And it just makes me wonder, like, what if someone didn't speak up, right? Or what if there aren't people at decision-making in decision-making rooms setting policy and setting procedure, thinking about what kind of barriers do we put up without even realizing it. So if we're putting out social media content as part of our communication programming and plan, but we're not doing it in the languages that our families speak and use, then how are we now, again, marginalizing another community? What if a Spanish-speaking family wanted to hear the live broadcast of a Board of Education meeting? Is the school district's communication, is it accessible to all, or is it creating barriers? Is it putting barriers in place? And how is it exclusionary, and how is it pushing families out when we are doing everything that we can to try to bring families in? So what barriers are we now putting in place, and have been putting in place, that really push out families? Another thing that I've been looking at is educator diversity. I think the district, Alamance Burlington, is about to release a report on demographic data of our educators. Here, this is just North Carolina data from an organization called Best NC, where you can see that Latino representation in our educators is at 2% versus versus the percentage for our Latino students. It does not match the population of our students, and we see that here in Alamance County. In Alamance County, demographically, Latinos make up 13% of the population, I think was the last stat that I read. But Latino students make up 27% of our students in Alamance Burlington, where our Latino educators make up less than 5% of educators throughout the district. So again, we see issues of representation and educator diversity that really could lead to again some of these impacts that we're seeing and some of these outcomes. If we had a more diverse and inclusive teacher workforce and administrative workforce, and a more diverse and inclusive district leadership, we would then start to see hopefully outcomes that would close some of these gaps that we're seeing, that would close these gaps that we're seeing, like here, for instance, going back to some of the academic data. But really, it's when we're looking at inequities in our system, we really have to look at it through a lens of racial equity, and looking at Latinos in particular, how Latino students and Latino families have been marginalized or pushed away from the system, and not through any fault of their own, but because of the policies and programming that we have been placed in our institutions. Sorry, I thought I saw a message pop up. Okay. And while we could talk a lot about the disparities we see, I really want to talk about sort of what opportunities does this year hold, right? We've really seen an opportunity. I know the pandemic has really galvanized a lot of people in our community wanting to think about bringing students back versus keeping them virtual until it's safe. And going back to sort of some of that decision making, right? Who is at the table? Who is being represented? So we're thinking about opening up schools, right? And we look at the data of which communities are being mostly impacted by COVID. We see overwhelmingly that the Hispanic and African American communities are the ones mostly impacted. And what does that mean then when we open up schools and we provide a choice to our families of you can stay virtual and or you can come back to school, right? Who is that choice really for? Right? The families that can choose to remain virtual and safe are the ones with access, are the ones with resources who are able to do that versus families who more likely than not would include more families that are Latino and African American back into our school buildings who would then be at a greater risk. And you can just look at the data. The data says that because of the inequities in our health system, because of the inequities in our housing system, that Hispanic and African American communities are more at risk from getting and having adverse impacts from COVID-19. So this is really where sort of advocacy and action come into play, and what we can do in this year and how we can use the pandemic as yes as something that we have to be safe about, but also as a way to reset, or as a way to really change what education can look like, especially for our marginalized communities. It's all about advocacy and action, right? So whether you're an educator or a parent or a family member or a student, we want to make sure to keep students in the pictures because they're some of the best advocates, right? When they advocate for themselves, and advocating for culturally responsive, right, and anti-racist policies and programming, what it looks like when we bring these practices into classrooms, into school buildings, into district level offices, and how they're using a lens of racial equity to make those decisions, so that when they do implement policies or when they revisit policies like ABSS is doing right now, then how are they determining who that policy is going to impact and what intended or unintended outcomes may be happening. So there's opportunities to really change how local politics really works. So the local school district is funded through the state. It gets its biggest source of funding from the state, and then followed by the county. And then there's also some federal dollars as well, but not as much as the state and county. So really looking at how we can use this election to really support candidates that are pro-education and that are looking to support and looking to bring in some of these changes. So this year in particular, our local county commissioners has 3 seats up for re-election, and being able to change that dynamic, right? 3 seats is a majority. So being able to put pro-education candidates in those seats that will really speak to and act for our students and our families and our educators, but then also making sure that we're able to then bring that same dynamic at the state level. So looking to elect candidates who are really passionate and supportive of public education. I saw that Ricky was just on. He's in District 6, or he's running for District 63. So being able to get a candidate like Ricky, who really knows, right, and has the perspective of being Latino himself, of how the policies and decisions made at a state level can then trickle down and impact what happens in our local educational system. Working with groups that are already doing this work, right? That provide a quality education for all. So Educación Sin Barreras, Every Child Counts NC, who are actively working to really make sure that our North Carolina legislators are are following through the promise of our Constitution. Our Constitution in North Carolina says that every child deserves an education, and every child receives a sound and basic education, right? Sound and basic doesn't sound like much, but it's a promise that we have not upheld. So making sure that working with organizations such as these that are holding legislators accountable, but then also working with legislators to make sure that that the supports that are needed to bring that promise to life. Organizations like Poder en Sí or Mi Gente that are really activating Latinos in North Carolina to get out and vote. Today is National Voter Registration Day, so if you're not registered, one of the biggest things that we can do to bring these changes is to get out and vote, and vote for candidates that are pro public education and that are really looking to support education here, not only here locally in Latinx County, but throughout the state. And there's some implications on the federal level too, right? Making sure that that we can have an administration on the federal level that understands how the Department of Education and the policies set forth in the Department of Education can really have an impact, or how and working to remove, right, the current administration that is very anti-Latino and anti-immigrant, so that we're able to have reverse some of these inequities that we're seeing in our system. Sorry, I felt like I think I went through that super fast, and I'm so sorry. I'm just a little bit nervous, but I do have an opportunity for questions if anyone has any.
A lot of information. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A.
And I hope there's questions, because it'd be great to just have a chat and a informal discussion. I think that's usually, we learn more in conversation than we do just listening from a presentation. But no, thank you again for the opportunity.
There is a question, but it was in the chat. Can you share with us a little bit about what priorities should ABSS have in thinking about what the current state of education is, not just locally, but also statewide and nationally?
Sure. So thinking about locally, ABSS does need to address these inequities, right? So thinking of how, what I was talking about earlier, right? When who's at the decision-making table and when they're setting programming and policies, there's this tool called the Racial Equity Impact Assessment that we use in Chapel Hill Carborough City Schools, that any policy or programming that comes before the Board of Education has gone through that tool. So we look at who's going to be impacted by that decision, right? And then have they had an opportunity to provide input, right? Are they part of are they providing input to the decision makers? And then what unintended or intended impacts that does that policy or program have on the communities, right? And then is it sustainable? And then if it is, and then how can we grow the program too? So it's really, that's one of the first things. I know also teacher diversity is an issue that is a priority. As I mentioned before, ABSS I think is going to put out a report. There's been a couple news articles, one from the Times News last week, and I think from Elon News Network just Monday, about the teacher diversity in ABSS. But that's not just a local issue. You see that across the state and across the country. One of the things that we could do is to make sure that interview teams are diverse, right? and having diverse interview teams, also looking at some grow your own programs for teachers. So I know we used to have teacher cadets in the past. So looking at how we can incentivize our local students to get into the teaching profession, and working in conjunction with programs like teaching fellows, and coming up with a local a local incentive. So if we have teachers from our students from our communities who are interested in becoming a teacher, then how can we provide some type of incentive, whether that's a full or partial scholarship to a college, as long as they come back to teach in our community.
There is a really good question here in the Q&A. What lessons have you drawn as a Latinx educator on how to best support Latinx students inside and outside of the classroom? How can the education system reimagine supporting students in a more holistic manner?
So one of the biggest things that I learned is that when we talk about resilient students in our system and in our society, we talk a lot about the individual and how the individual is resilient and how the individual has grit. One thing that I've drawn from my experience as a Latino student and Latinx educator, as well as from the Latinx students and families that I've worked with, is not about how resilient the individual is, but how resilient the community is, and bringing in the community entero, right? And bringing in families and extended families, and how communities can come together to really push us forward. So educational systems and reimagining, right, in a more holistic manner. I'm afraid reimagining isn't enough. It's I think for a lot of us who are doing this work, these barriers are in place and they're working, right? And it's more about knocking down these barriers and creating new. Because when we look at the whole child and looking at a student more holistically, right now our current system is all about, high stakes testing and the outcomes of one data point, and relying on that data point to make decisions for students, when we're not looking how the different genius and power that each student brings uniquely, right? And we're comparing them to a test that the test itself is biased, has bias in it. So really looking at creating something new. And I know that's like not an answer to the question, but it's really something that we need to think about, because we really need to recognize and value and celebrate the identities of our students. And we don't do that when we're only looking at data points and outcomes.
Absolutely. And that, what you just said relates a little bit to what India is asking here. What would you say is the most important thing for educators inside the classroom to remember when they are educating multicultural students? What about working with the system as opposed to outside of it? And I think I would add to that, right? I mean, you mentioned before, we don't have a lot of teachers that look like the students, right? Or the students don't have a lot of teachers that look like them. But then how do we tackle the other, right? I mean, how do we give tools to white teachers or those who don't identify as Latinx to be able to work with these multicultural or students with different ethnicities and identities?
Yeah, no, and that's a fantastic question. We definitely need resources and tools in place for all our teachers, right? Not just white teachers, but for all our teachers. Because when we look at educational systems in the United States in particular, a lot of the systemic barriers that are put in place come from the racial history that is uniquely American, right? And so it's important not just for white teachers, but also teachers from other countries who come in to understand sort of the racial history of America and understand and look at what biases each of us hold. And it's something that we need to recognize every day. And that's providing professional development to staff and faculty about what culturally responsive education looks like, and culturally sustaining and affirming education looks like. It looks like it provides education on anti-racist policies. So when we look at the curriculum that we're using, that we can look at it through that lens. When we look at sort of some of the text that we bring in, right, that we challenge the idea that not everything that was done before has to be done again, that we can change things up, especially when it's to the benefit of our students, so that they can start to see themselves not only see themselves in some of the faculty or staff members of the building, but to see themselves in the curriculum, see themselves in the art they're making, see themselves in the music that they're learning about, see themselves in the history, right? There's a rich history of Latino culture that is more than just colonization and immigration, that oftentimes is left out.
Dr. Me has also asked, in reference to what you were talking about, the surveys, are there ways that our students might be able to contact someone to volunteer their services? I'm sorry. Allergy season here. So how can our students volunteer in the community?
Yeah, so there's lots of different volunteer opportunities. I don't want to speak to any specifically because I don't want to put any false information out there. But you can look at volunteers opportunity. I know the United Way here in Alamance County has a great portal for volunteer opportunities in Alamance County. But there, I think for students themselves, I know there's a lot of extracurricular clubs that really could take on some of these, especially if they did it as a club, where they could look for a need in the community and then find ways to fill it. It's something that we do. So I sit on the board of ISLA, and one of the things that they do with their Jóvenes program, or Isla Impacta, is that the students develop a service learning project for the benefit of their community. So it's specifically Latino students volunteering and creating a project for the benefit of their Latino community.
We have another question here, and it's something that is come up a lot for students in general, right? I mean, what are the effects and consequences of the presence of police in public schools on the learning, the development, and the safety, especially of our Latinx students? And I'm going to add, especially here in Alamance County, right?
Right. And in Alamance County, a little less than half of the juvenile juvenile contact points, or entrances into the justice system for juveniles, comes from school buildings, or something that occurred at the school, and that's a little less than half in Alamance County. But specifically to that question, right? When there is a police presence at a building, and when we talk about how in Alamance County specifically, that the sheriff's department, a local enforcement organization, local law enforcement organization here, is in partnership with ICE, right? And what impact that has, right? In the perception of police in school buildings, and how they may be keeping Latino families away, right, and from participating. That's a detriment. But also once that student is now affected by that system, right, we see there throughout the country that the students affected the most by school resource officers tend to be Black and brown students, and again, that's another disproportionality. Even though the crime rates are happening at pretty similar instances, it's at pretty similar rates, that the students that are being policed are Black and brown, and they're the ones who are then being introduced into the to the criminal justice system. So there is a bias and this clear inequity that definitely affects our Black and brown students, and our Latino students.
That's really interesting. When you were talking about the importance not just of the students being able to see themselves in the teachers, but also in the curriculum, the student asked, how can educators take steps to decolonize the curriculum taught in schools to teach history comprehensively?
Yeah, no, I love the term decolonization, right? And I think and that's something that I was starting to do even before I knew what that term was, right? When I noticed students, or when I was teaching students who look like me, I was then more fully able to bring back part of my identity and bring back part of my culture, and not be afraid to share that in an educational space. So like one of the first things that educators can do to decolonize is to learn the true history, right? Because they've been colonized themselves. The colonization didn't happen centuries ago. Colonization continues to happen today, in what we learn, in the media we digest. So being active in teaching a truer narrative of what that looks like, specifically in the context here of sort of American history, and how colonization, what that looked like, how that affected indigenous populations, and how when we decolonize it, it's a calling back to our ancestors beyond, right, beyond sort of the Eurocentric history that we've been taught, right, but looking more at the roots of the lands that we come from.
And I do like this question a lot, because I think that one of the goals of these types of events is also to provide students with tools, with advice, with strategies on how to become activists, right? And how to then go and contribute to society in different ways once they graduate, while they're students, but also once they graduate. And they're asking, how, are you aware of any fellowships or post-grad opportunities for recent college graduates interested in working with and supporting students of color in the education system, assisting with their access and success specifically?
So one of the things that comes right to the top of mind for me is Latinx Ed,
Mm-hmm.
who Ricky was just on. He's one of the co-founders.
Mm-hmm.
They have, from what I remember, they have some postgraduate opportunities um, um, for students that work specifically with, um, and then they're working starting from middle school, but it's really looking at access to post K-12 education. So what opportunities can 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 we provide to Latinx students so that they continue their education past graduation?
On in a similar note, having been an educator in the Alamos Burlington school system and having gone through the Alamos Burlington school system, what are some opportunities, or where do you see gaps from the university or from our students, in particular those that are not just those that are studying to become teachers, but the rest of the community, in terms of what are some of the things that we could be doing in helping support those Latinx Hispanic students, especially in the system here in Alamus County?
Um, so I think one of the things that would be beneficial is like creation of some affinity spaces, right? So for Latinx teachers, I know like I was one of 3 Latinx teachers when I was at Graham, and that was rare that we had that many. If there is a Latinx teacher in a building, it's usually just one. So bringing those teachers together, but then creating a bridge between the university, right, and the school system. So bringing in Latinx faculty members from the university and the Latinx student organizations from the university to really create a community where we can celebrate and honor our identities, but then also it's a place where we can find sort of like social and emotional wellness as well, because the Latinx community is not a monolithic block. We are diverse, and um, we are varied, but there are things that bring us together. So being able to share and celebrate in those spaces, I think would be a great opportunity to create a bridge between sort of district, and incorporating Latinx students and families from the district as well.
So I have a question. With COVID-19 and all of 2020 in reality, we have seen that the Latinx community faces a lot of inequities. One of these inequities is mental health. How can we educate and normalize the importance of mental health in the Latinx community, especially regarding K through 12 education and higher education?
Yeah, no, I think one of the things that we can do to normalize it is to talk about it, right? And especially for Latinx men, right, who culturally are told, right, that these issues aren't something you talk about, aren't something that you express. Like I have mental health issues. I suffer from depression sometimes, but being able to openly talk about that, and in a space where you can make that, you can start to normalize it, and it'll take time, um, and even having those conversations with family members could be the hardest. But finding spaces where you can start to have those discussions and then model that openness and vulnerabilities in front of others.
Well, I think that that was the end of the question. So thank you so much, Dyson, for joining us today, for taking the time. I know that you had a busy day today as well. So I appreciate the time that you took to be with us. Also to those people that participated in the conversation and that participated in the talk, thank you. I know that it was a long time for presentations, but appreciate those that stay with us today. So again, thank you everybody for joining us today for Perspectivas, and we hope to see you in the next events. We have our identity panel next Wednesday, and you'll get the information soon. So again, thank you so much everybody for joining us today. Dyson, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And again, hopefully we'll be able to connect a little bit more.